Are we live? Yeah. All right. Hopefully you guys can hear us. We'll get feedback in a minute. Make sure we're good. It's Mike Shower coming from you. That didn't make sense. Coming from Juneau, talking to you on Tuesday night, where the weather is still terrible in Juneau. Snowing, kinda. Hopefully it's a little better back home in District E. Here to talk about a couple things tonight. Do the standard dozer debrief. A couple things about what's going on, transparency in your government, et cetera, right? So, hopefully you can see the board. I'm going to talk about it, and we will take a picture at the end, a close-up like we've done before, so it's up there. I know at times it's hard to read, and I also know I got to not talk too fast, so I'll do my best to not talk too fast. So we're going to talk about tonight, jump right into it just for the sake of time, talk a little bit about the supplemental budget, because we have the budget process going on right now. So we've got the supplemental budget we're dealing with. The operating budgets are over in the House right now, going through that to get that over to the Senate. We have the mental health budget, which usually isn't too much of a big one because it's got a different funding source and mental health issues. It's usually a pretty clean process. But the operating and the capital budget, less clean, supplemental, etc. So talk about that a little bit tonight, focusing primarily on the supplemental budget because that's already come over from the House to the Senate. And we're looking at how that's going to play out, what's been added to it, how it's gone out. The governor passed a pretty big supplemental budget, perhaps one of the bigger ones in the state's history. So there's some things in it that I want to talk about. The House, I'll get to what they did here in a minute with it. But let's talk about what that supplemental budget is. Why do we have one? Probably a good analogy, at least in some point, is that you have a budget for your house. And during the course of a year, let's say your car breaks down. You didn't budget for it, but it's something you got to spend money on because you need it. So in some ways, people would say that's analogous to how we do it with the supplemental budget for the government. We have it because if you are budgeting for a certain amount of bills, and let's say you get other bills, and a good example of this would be the fires. We had a heavy fire season, and so in this particular case, we spent more money than we planned on, so we've already paid those bills, or we've already essentially spent the money, if you will, but we have to budget for it and pay it back. So we haven't done that yet in some of those cases. Some of the things I'll talk about a little bit when we get to it, that's kind of the process for having one. Why is it different from the operating and capital budget? The operating and capital budget we passed for the year. The operating budget is essentially your government. That's all your agencies, Department of Public Safety, that's the governor's office, that's all those different things right out there, Department of Transportation, you name it. The capital budget, I know we've gone over it before, is what we do for basically infrastructure, building things. So your capital budget would be how you would pay for road maintenance, bridges, buildings, etc., things like that by and large. And we get quite a bit of federal money as a small state from the federal government, put the minimum amount in and get money back, it's kind of back of our tax dollars to use for the capital budget. So they're a little bit different. They typically happen during the session, but the supplemental for the previous year, so the year we're living in right now of basically the summer of 1 July of 2019 to 30 June of 2020 is this budget period, right? And we'll have a supplemental that comes up for expenses that we paid. So we'll continue on with that. So last year to this year, pretty flat budget overall as far as what the governor handed the legislature compared to last year's request, which was a pretty big drop from the previous year, caused all of the mini mushroom clouds all over the state with the budget reductions and then the veto wars that we went through. But it's pretty flat this year. So we have a big supplemental. What are some of the biggest things that are coming to the supplemental? We have the fire season that was really high, so it was about $110 million was the total cost that we're given for that. We have some things from the earthquake still that we're cleaning up, some school construction, other types of things that are still happening. Those are legitimate because you go, yep, those happen, can't really plan for them, so be it, all right? And then you have Medicaid. Now, Medicaid's a little bit of a different beast because Governor Walker previously expanded that program significantly. The state has had to pay more money. We went from, I can't remember exactly, but we're at 240,000 Alaskans. About a third of the state is now on Medicaid. Many of those of working age, etc. That's been a pretty big deal because we're trying to figure out how to contain costs, or I couldn't speak there, of Medicaid because that is significant money. And in that expansion with Medicaid, you also had a lot of people that the federal government's now paying for. So when we say, oh, don't worry about it, the state's not paying, it's kind of like saying it's free, it's not. We're still paying for it because we're taxpayers. And remember, folks, the federal government, we're at about $21 trillion plus in debt right now. That big time bomb is ticking, and it's coming our way, and our kids and our grandkids too. So it's not like we can just say it's free money from the federal government. It's really not, okay? But that's a big part of it, and that's the majority of the supplemental budget, okay? That's usually the kind of things that we're paying for I've talked to Commissioner Crum from Health and Human Services, and he says, or Social Services, and he says that they're going to try to budget better with Medicaid because every year they come back with this big bill. We're going, why are we doing that? We should be able to see about where we are. We get a little bit, 5, 10, 15 million, something. We're going to have some adjustments, understand, with the population, but we're seeing these big Medicaid bills, supplementals every year. It's almost like we're trying to make it seem less painful early and put more money in later. And I did forget to say one thing about that supplemental. Remember, there's a difference here, and it's a little bit contentious. The operating capital budget, they get well vetted. They go through, they're introduced, they go through committees to subcommittees, there's a lot of discussion, there's experts that come in, testimony, public testimony, amendments can be put in. You got time to dig down and figure out what's really going on and make some changes, right? But in the supplemental budget, we don't really do that. It pretty much kind of gets run through. It doesn't go through that big process. And that can be disconcerting because we're not really drilling down on what we're spending money on. How is it being spent? Where's it coming from? Who's it going to, et cetera. So it gets a little bit like, well, where's the money going and what am I signing a check for, right? So that's a little bit different. And there is a difference between them. For this supplemental this year, we do have some veto add backs from last year. Not many, maybe 3-ish. And they're not too much money, but there were some veto add backs from the stuff we did before over the last, 7, 8, 9 months now. There were some things that I would consider to be unnecessary in the supplemental budget. There are things that we put in, and I won't go into detail and all because I went through line by line like 60-something items today with some of the experts to try to figure out exactly what the bills are and do we really need it or not, where it came from. So some of it, in my opinion, is unnecessary in the supplemental budget. And, depending on how you want to do the math, and everybody's different, $15 to $25 million-ish in that ballpark, I think we don't really have to have in the supplemental budget. I'd like to see those things kind of taken out of it somewhere in that ballpark. And I think that you're getting closer to the actual bills that we really do have to pay as opposed to things we were putting in that don't need to be in a supplemental that essentially gets fast-tracked that we don't have the time to slow down and fully vet and know exactly what we're paying for. Some of these things, in my opinion, need to be back in that normal process where you get to vet them better. Okay, so that makes it a little harder to swallow the pill, if you will, about where some of these things are. And look, some of them are legitimate, there's no doubt. And the majority of it is based on that number. Still a big number, folks. And that $300 million is what that supplemental was, $300 million, okay? And so here's what's most disappointing, and I've mentioned this in Facebook before, talked about it in the last few weeks, is that $300 million essentially we're wiping out, even with the fires, which is a big part of the M plan, we're essentially wiping out almost all of the reductions to the budget that we have. And it seems nigh impossible in this state, with the size of our state government and how small our population is, and the highest percentage of state workers in the per capita in the nation, and all the special interest groups and everything that happened last year. Well, you notice I don't see all these special interest groups out protesting now that they got a budget that's flat. Also, they got their money and everything's good. We tried to reduce the cost of this government last year, and things just fell apart. Well, guess what? With that supplemental, we're almost right back to where we started last year. So again, the ability to reduce the cost of this government seems nigh impossible with the group we have here and special interests, lobbyists, all the things that come up as part of that. So what am I telling you with that is like, boy, I don't know how we reduce the cost of this government with where we sit today after the effort and where we went, because we essentially just pedaled our feet like Fred Flintstone in the car. We didn't get anywhere, okay? But that's what we got right now, and that's where we are. So that's part of it. I'm going to talk just briefly about what the House did, just so you know, since they passed it. We're talking supplemental tonight. The House did pass us a supplemental with very small changes. They didn't actually make any reductions. They moved a few items out, really just a few, into what could be the capital budget, where they could potentially do it over there. But essentially, it was a pretty clean bill from the governor to the House, sent over to the Senate. They did tighten up the CBR, the Constitutional Budget Reserve language. It was a little more broad. It's a good move. It's for this bill only, just this one supplemental, so it doesn't open it up to other things. That's positive. That's what the House handed us. So what the Senate's going to do with it, wait to see how we're going to come out with this, because there's a lot of negotiation going on right now. So many things are added into it, and I'll go into detail and explain that a little bit later once it fully comes out and I know what we have. I just don't have a final answer yet. So let's move on to the next kind of part of this that kind of flows into this. What do we got right now? Why is this in red? Triple threat, okay? I'm going to talk about COVID-19, the virus, here in a second. But we do have a triple threat right now, and that's why it's in red. We have the price of oil, which I believe ANS is today, looking at earlier, is about $34 a barrel. That's not good, because we need probably upwards of 60-ish to be able to sustain barely where we are with the budget we have. We really need more than that because our spending is so high compared to what we have for actual revenue. That's a big deal, okay? That's our big part of our revenue. Stock market's taking a big hit, the permanent fund. Remember, I've told you before, a good actually the majority of our earnings or the revenue of the state is coming from that permanent fund now, no longer from oil and gas. Big deal. And then we're going to take a big hit in tourism. Why? As George W. would say, tourism, right? So you got COVID-19 up there that's kind of hitting us. And we know we're going to see a reduction in cruise ships and other folks flying in here. So likely we're going to take a pretty big hit. That's a triple threat on our economy and the revenue coming into the state. And that's going to matter. This isn't gloom and doom. This is reality, what we're dealing with. So when we start talking about the budget and how we're going to pay for the size of this government, because we can't seem to constrain it and make it smaller, less expensive, start talking about your dividend, how much that's going to be, right? And you've seen some, proposals already in the House between, 20% to 15% of the leftovers given to the people in the form of a dividend. We're outnumbered, folks. I don't know what to tell you with this one. And when you add these things into it, the pressure is going to be intense to take more of the dividend to pay for the size of this government. I don't know what else to say. I don't. But I will put down here in blue, I'm like, how about reductions to spending now? Would be awful nice to have some of those in there to take pressure off of where we are, wouldn't it? But we couldn't have those because we're just too doggone stuck on our addiction to spending money and the size of this government. And people have been trying to say it and arguing on Facebook, well, we cut to the bone, we can't get there. I'm here to tell you, folks, there's a lot of things we're looking at that you absolutely can. When you try to tell me there's no way we can cut anymore, you're wrong. And I'll tell you why you're wrong. You can look at the number of unfilled vacancies that are still budgeted inside this government. And the last check I had from DOA last year was over 3,000. That could be north of $200 million. And do we need to cut all of those down? Nope, a certain number of vacancies. But the bottom line is, absolutely, there's room in there. And we could drop those a certain percentage out to save us $10, $50, $100 million. We are not looking at efficiencies in K through 12. I've got a bill out for that. It's probably not going to get a hearing this year. We're not doing anything on it. Talk about efficiencies with the university system. Selling some of the 1,251 facilities DOT has that we maintain and spend money on we don't need. Things with the ferry system and how it was inefficiently operated for years. I mean, there's literally dozens of things that we could do better. So to say that we've cut to the bone is absolutely incorrect. We have to do it carefully. We have to do it in a way that makes sense so we don't hurt vulnerable population. We don't take away services, maybe, from ferries once a week to instead of once a month. I mean, there's different things we can do, but don't tell me we can't be more efficient. We absolutely can. Got a question here. The governor's cuts. Oh, yeah, got it. I'm not sure what I said. I might have said something different. So, $14 billion in the CBR would have been awful nice. And remember, folks, because we have an addiction to spending, and previous legislatures and governors kept spending that $14 billion down, we have, roughly, I think, $2-ish billion left in the CBR. I'd have to look at the current numbers. It's in the ballpark. It's very little. Not enough to get us through that. With the size of this government, not constricting it, the inability to reduce the cost of government, we don't have the money to weather a storm like this right now. And that's a problem. And this is kind of the gloom and doom night, and I wish it wasn't, but it kind of is, because that's reality. You know me, I'm not going to pull any punches. We have put ourselves into a place where we're in a bit of a square corner. Even the stock market is, with $3 or $4 billion, I think, off the permanent fund right now. I mean, it's significant that's happening to us, but we spent the money, kept the party going, refused to drop our spending, and that's where we are now. We don't have the ability to weather this storm right now because we spent our savings away. By the way, I'm going to put my last plug in. That all happened under a binding caucus. Just saying, that's the only way we can do business apparently, but doggone it if we didn't spend that money under a binding caucus. All right. Moving on to COVID-19, last part of the night, because this does kind of tie into everything that's happening here. So let's talk about the coronavirus up here. I wrote about this a little bit on Facebook last week as this is happening, but look, there's some important things here that are really important for us as a state and as a citizenry to do and to not do. Number one, this is not the zombie apocalypse, okay? It's not. The medical data shows that up to about, into the mid to late 70s, the mortality rate is below 1%, well below 1%, unless you have some kind of autoimmune or others, like COPD, something else that's really going to affect you. You're probably going to be just fine. You might catch it. You might be like the crappy flu, but you'll survive it just fine. And the younger you are, the healthier you are, the better off you are. Like, it almost doesn't affect children at all. So you get up into 80 years old plus, the mortality rate actually goes up. So it does actually matter at a certain point for the medical data. Remember, there's some things that are different about it. It lasts longer on surfaces. Was it bioengineered? Did it come out of China? That appears to be the data. Doesn't really matter. It's here. But it does last longer on surfaces. So sanitizing things, doorknobs, that kind of stuff, making sure everything's clean, careful of what you touching that kind of stuff, that's important. Be cognizant of that. It does have up to about a 28-day incubation period, so you can not feel symptoms for a long time, and because you come back from somewhere doesn't mean you're not sick. Not a big deal, just got to be aware of it, right? And so those are just things to consider, getting masks and cleaning yourself, do normal stuff, like you don't want to get sick with somebody. It is airborne, so it does come out. You can be in a room with people and you can still potentially contract it. But just remember, folks, one, you're not going to turn into a zombie. Two, the chance of you dying from this is really, really small. The other flu, it kills more people than what it's done so far. We don't know the final result on this, but what I'm trying to tell you is here's the biggest word I want to throw out. Do not panic, okay? The one thing that always gets us is when people panic and they run to the store and they buy everything off the shelves and they don't have what they need and we're not ready. Alaska is probably one of the most prepared people on the planet, unless you're way out in the middle of, the Siberian Russia or something. So here's what I'll tell you. Treat it like any other big event. Be prepared. Have about 6 to 8 weeks. I've done it. The last big exercise I did before I retired from the Air Force was the Arctic Edge. Big earthquake exercise. You need to be able to survive kind of with food and basic supplies, what you need for about 6 to 8 weeks. Some the food type stuff, some access to water, if you need medicine, etc. The basics. If you have that, you'll probably be fine almost no matter what happens, okay? But what happens if you don't have that stuff and all of a sudden COVID-19 pops up in Alaska, which it's going to at some point, somebody probably already has it, and it pops in the Matsu or it pops in Juneau or Anchorage. All of a sudden, people are going to panic and run to the store. 3 to 4 days, the shelves are clean. There's not much coming up. And remember, this is an important thing for Alaska. For us, it's standard. We're a long logistics trail. Okay? So in this case, it takes a long time for stuff to come up. If they go into quarantine or people start panicking about it and states or the federal government starts to shut things down, movement, etc., it's going to be tough to get stuff up here. So be prepared now. Don't go out and buy, 50 packs of toilet paper. You don't necessarily need that, but have the basics, okay? So I know I spent probably a few extra minutes on that than I really wanted to, but I think this is a big deal because some of this affects this a great deal, what's happening to us now with the budget data and where we're going to go in the battle over the next year. But this COVID-19 thing is on top of us right now. It's going to affect us. It's affecting jobs, movement, etc. I just don't want you to panic. We can survive virtually anything if you don't panic. Some people are going to get it. Some people are going to get sick. Very few people will die. And that's not to minimize the folks that could be affected. That's all real stuff, like the flu or any other disease. But most of us are going to be just fine. And so don't panic. Take care of each other. Take normal precautions. We will be fine. More to follow next week as we get into the supplemental budget and the operating budgets and the capital budgets. And at some point, we're going to talk about the PFD, which we're not even discussing right now. I think my camera person is going to get over there so they can see the board a little bit better. I'll step out of the way for a moment. And did we have any questions from anybody that popped up? Okay. So you can see the stuff on the board tonight, folks. As always, I appreciate you spending time with us down here in Juneau for a few minutes, trying to keep these a little shorter. This is about 16 minutes. It's probably a little better. Next week, we're going to probably, like I said, talk operating capital. If they're around, we'll talk PFD. If I'm starting to hear anything, just trust me, it's going to be a low number based on all this stuff. I don't know what else to tell you. We'll give you updates on COVID if we have more, and we'll continue. Like always, if you have some questions, go ahead and give those to us. You can send them to the Facebook where I post about the time and what day it will be, and we'll try to answer those up early. You can throw some out here while we're going during the Facebook Live, and I'll try to answer questions later. So continue to give me topics, things you want to hear about, and I will answer those. Next week I may talk a little bit about how a bill flows through here, because I've actually gotten a lot of questions on that. Just that continual education process, because people are giving some good questions, so we'll do our best. We're going to give it a shot, folks. It's going to be a tough year, and we may be moving out of here sooner than we prefer to get all this stuff done, but so be it. We'll be in touch with you next week. Thanks again for taking the time. You guys have a good night.